People of the American West. Biographies of specific people. Chief Joseph was a Nez Perce Indian chief. He was famous for leading his people away from battle. The United States government ordered Joseph's people to move from Oregon to a reservation in Idaho. In June 1877, war broke out between Joseph's people and the U.S. Army. Joseph's people won several battles, but Joseph knew they could not defeat the army. He led his people toward Canada, hoping to join with Sioux Indians there. Joseph led his people for more than 1,000 miles, fighting off army troops along the way. Finally, not far from the Canadian border, he surrendered or gave up. The United States government then sent Joseph and his people to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Joseph later lived on a reservation in Washington state. George Armstrong Custer, born in 1839 and died in 1876, was a United States Army officer. He fought for the Union during the American Civil War. The Union was made up of the northern states and many western states. After the war, Custer was sent to fight the American Indians. He and the soldiers under him joined other troops trying to force the Sioux and Cheyenne Indians onto reservations. The reservations were areas of land that the government set aside for American Indians. Custer is best known for the Battle of Little Bighorn. This battle took place in the Montana Territory on June 25, 1876. In this battle, the Sioux and Cheyenne killed Custer and all of his men. It became known as Custer's Last Stand. Sitting Bull was a famous medicine man of the Hunkpapa Sioux Indians. He was born in what now is South Dakota. In 1875, Sitting Bull had a vision, or a dreamlike idea. He told the Sioux to change their way of fighting. On June 25, 1876, they won the Battle of Little Bighorn. U.S. Army leader Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer was killed in the battle. After the battle, Sitting Bull and his followers were chased north into Canada. 4 years later, Sitting Bull came back to the United States and surrendered, or gave up. Later, he lived on a reservation, an area of land where the U.S. government made Indians live. The government thought Sitting Bull would start another war. When officers tried to arrest him, he was killed. Geronimo was a Chiricahua Apache Indian. He was born in what is now western New Mexico and grew up in Mexico. His Apache name was Goyele, which means the smart one. In about 1877, the United States government moved Geronimo's people to a reservation in Arizona. This increased conflicts between the Indians and white settlers. Geronimo escaped from the reservation several times. In 1882, he and the other Apaches set up hidden camps in the mountains. From there, they made many raids. United States troops forced them to surrender in 1883. The U.S. government moved Geronimo to Fort Still in Oklahoma in 1894. He lived there the rest of his life. Descriptions of groups of people. Cowboys are people who help take care of large herds of cattle. In the United States, cowboys were much admired in the days of the Old West. Cowboys were most important during a period that lasted only about 20 years, from the mid-1860s to the mid-1880s. Actually, a cowboy's life was filled with hard work, danger, and loneliness. On the ranch, a cowboy's main job was to protect the cattle as they grazed. Before barbed wire fences became common, cattle roamed freely on the open range. They could wander for long distances in any direction. Cowboys often had to pull cattle from quicksand and drag them out of mud. Cowboys also had to protect them from wild animals and cattle rustlers, or thieves. The roundup and the trail drive were major events in a cowboy's life. Roundups took place every spring and fall. During a roundup, cattle owned by many ranches were brought to one place. Then the newborn calves were branded. A brand was a mark burned into the calf's skin. It showed who owned the animal. A trail drive usually lasted about 2 or 3 months. It covered as much as 1,000 miles. During a trail drive, cowboys moved from 2,000 to 3,000 cattle from western ranches to railway stations. From the stations, the cattle were shipped to cities, where they were sold. Exodusters. When the last federal troops left the South in 1877 and Reconstruction gave way to renewed racial oppression, a former slave named Benjamin Pap Singleton began urging blacks to form their own independent communities in the West. Those who followed his advice called themselves Exodusters because they believed the West would prove their promised land. Soon, these early Exodusters' hopeful letters home were being read aloud in black churches across the South, and in the spring of 1879, word spread that the federal government had set all of Kansas aside for former slaves. The rumor was false, but it sparked a genuine exodus that brought more than 15,000 African Americans into Kansas within the next year. Sod busters. The plains could not be farmed by the usual methods of the 1860s. Most parts of the region had little rainfall and too few streams for irrigation. The plains farmers, known as sodbusters, needed new methods and tools. One approach, called dry farming, was to plant seeds deep in the ground where there was some moisture. Wooden plows could not penetrate the tough layer of sod, but in the late 1870s, farmers could use the newly invented lightweight steel plows to do the job. The sodbusters had other tools to help them conquer the plains: windmills to pump water from deep in the ground, and new fencing called barbed wire. With no wood to build fences, farmers used these wire fences to protect their land. Dry farming, however, did not produce large crop yields, and the 160-acre grants were too small to make a living. Most farmers needed at least 300 acres, as well as advanced machinery to make a plains farm profitable. Many farmers went into debt. Others lost ownership of their farms and then had to rent the land. The last part of the plains to be settled was the Oklahoma Territory, which Congress had designated as Indian Territory in the 1830s. In 1889, after years of pressure from land dealers and settlers groups, the federal government opened Oklahoma to homesteaders. On the morning of April 22, 1889, the official opening day, more than 10,000 people lined up on the edge of this land. At the sound of a bugle, the homesteaders charged across the border to stake their claims. The eager boomers, as the homesteaders were called, discovered to their dismay that some settlers had already slipped into Oklahoma. These so-called Sooners had already claimed most of the best land. Within a few years, all of Oklahoma was opened to settlement.